Awesome. So my name's Tom Fuller. I run the engineering team here. Good to meet any of you who haven't met before. My training partner is Greg Kunkel. He's here, and we're going to kind of jointly give this. I'll give the first part, and Greg will give the second part. We're having some technical issues here, but no, keep on the first page, please. I'll let you know when to change. Yeah, so maybe to give a little bit of context to this, so NextJump has worked, really with thousands of organizations, through Academy clients, all sorts of ways. Academy in particular is like an experiential event. So it's one of the principles of 21st century orgs in particular is that there's a lot of experiential learning versus classroom style learning. That said, one of the things we are working on is documenting a lot of kind of lessons learned, implementation procedures, that kind of thing. And so in particular, two things. Today on Thursday, we're going over what will go wrong. So in two dimensions, what goes wrong when you turn the lights on with feedback. So when you start implementing a feedback program in an organization, what are the typical things that happen? In particular, there's we call sort of opt-out narratives, that this fear at the beginning, even before you start, we've seen kind of very common fears that show up. And so what are those and how do you address them? Then month one, 2, and 3. So over like the 90-day period, so Charlie was talking about, there's a process we've seen all over from biology and psychology to really implement a new behavior. It's a 90-day process. So what happens in feedback in particular, month 1, month 2, and month 3. So part of this that I'm going to go over is what to expect, what goes wrong with feedback. Part 2, Greg will go over is what to expect when you start training next generation of decision makers, when you start implementing coaching programs at scale. And the idea is that we've really learned through Academy that a big part of success is understanding kind of the bumps and challenges ahead of time. So part of it's just psychological. When you know what's coming, you're better prepared. But part is that it's sort of baked into what we'll go over tomorrow in terms of our recommendation for how you kind of roll out these programs successfully. So I think that's the intro. Then can I control this or not? Yes. Okay. So big yellow divider here. So we're going to start talking about what happens. What are the challenges that show up when you start implementing feedback programs? So this, as I said, this is a written document. So this is, and we haven't really PowerPointed it. So this is not ideal. Basically, it's a series of very dense pages like this. Rule number 1 in PowerPoint: don't put up giant pages like this. But I'm doing it. But I'm going to give you. We kind of share this after, but I'll give a flavor of kind of important points and in what's in there. So this is this page here is a summary of fears that show up or kind of challenges that show up even before you start. So I'll just kind of read some of the headlines here. But senior leaders are afraid of getting ones, meaning I'll go into that one in more depth. But in our feedback app, for those of you that haven't been to the prior Academy, so 1, there's kind of a rating of 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1 is needs improvement, 2 meets expectation, 3 exceeds, 4 far exceeds. So 1 is like, you're getting critical feedback. You're doing bad. You need to do better. That's kind of the leader view. There's a sort of team member view that will this critical feedback, especially if it's kind of public, will it negatively influence my performance eval? Will I not get promoted? And if the military, the fit rep, right, whatever that term is, like, will somehow this bleed into that and cause a problem? Other things, transparency between teams. If you have a culture of open feedback and my team over here can see, or other teams can see my team, that's kind of scary. I don't like that. Junior people are immature. We hear this a lot around, they just can't handle that responsibility of actually being able to give candid feedback publicly. Are they up to that task? A fifth one is opting out. We hear that a lot. Like, I'm too scared right now and I don't want to participate in this. So I'm not going to go into all of this stuff. But to zone in on the first 2 in particular, they're really 2 sides of the same coin, which is fear of looking bad in front of others. So from a leader perspective, will I, the military is a good term, but good order and discipline, will that get affected if people can publicly give feedback? And then from the sort of team member side, will will that affect my ability to be promoted? And so I think it leads to, particularly on the leader side, it leads to this behavior where, okay, if I fear that getting ones and getting kind of, demonstrating that I'm not this kind of, I know everything and perfect, but I'm going to avoid that. So I'm going to actually start playing it safe. And what we've actually found is the opposite, that the top performers are the ones that are actually, they're getting, 3s and 4s, they're getting good ratings, but they're also the ones getting the most 1s. It's, in fact, once this starts rolling, you end up with seeing how the top performers are the ones that are willing to take risk. It's the ones that are playing it safe, the ones that aren't taking any risk, the ones that aren't modeling the behavior of putting something out there, learning from it and adjusting. Those are if you do that, you do well. If you don't do that, you don't do well. And I think fundamentally that is that's the mind shift that teams have to kind of go through. That the elephant model that Charlie was going over yesterday of an org, kind of embedded in that is that I'm the leader. So by definition, whatever I come up with is right. So my my authority as a leader is defined by the fact that I always know the right answer. I must get 3s and 4s, otherwise I'm not the leader. As opposed to the ethos that my job as a leader is to find the right answer fastest. And those are the people that put out ideas, they adjust and get better. I thought there was an awesome example of that in the Navy a couple weeks ago now. So Admiral Burke, who's been piloting a feedback program, spearheading it in the Navy, he put out what is effectively like a 2019 plan. So it had, for their basically kind of HR objectives for the Navy for 2019. He did it at kind of a larger all hands meeting. He got a bunch of critical feedback, ones and whatnot, like things that were missing. And then he did a very courageous thing, which we recommend, which is he actually kind of read that overnight, digested it, and then he responded back. So he did an email to the participants in the groups and called out, this is some of the feedback that I got, some of that resonated, some of that didn't. And he did it in a very kind of, cool way, in that it's not a democracy. It's not that you get feedback and you should, do whatever the crowd is saying. He said, this is some of the, I hear you, some of it, I hear that's a good idea, but we can't do it for X, Y, and Z reasons, or I hear it and that's actually something I hadn't thought of, but he responded to it and actually made the plan better. And I think that is the idea of not using feedback as this thing to be afraid of, but using feedback as this tool that actually helps you make better decisions and improve the whole team going forward. So I think that's probably the biggest thing in this page, is kind of this fear of looking bad in front of others. And there's both kind of a senior version and a more junior version. The other thing, just touch on for a minute, was that kind of junior people are immature. We hear this a lot in that, especially in regard to millennials, like we can't really trust them to give feedback. Like who knows what they're going to say? There's I think a couple realities to that. One is, everything all right? Yeah, got some feedback here. The reality is they're already out there on social media anyway, whether it's on Reddit or other forums leaving information. But when you implement a feedback system, the idea is that it's in a closed loop system. The fear of inappropriate behavior is much greater than the reality of it. Any kind of inappropriate comments or trolling, or that's what people are afraid of. People write some crazy thing that's just totally inappropriate, and there are ways to deal with that if someone writes something like that. But the reality is less than 0.1% of feedback kind of goes into that bucket. It's very rare, because the reality is this is a closed loop network. It's not like if you go out to Reddit or something like that, it's kind of, you can make a fake identity, fake email address, you can write whatever the heck you want. This is, you are a known person. So in the back end of the system, it is actually connected to you. But it's one fear that it's, ahead of time, it's a greater fear than the reality of the situation. So that's kind of before you get started. Oh, I think there's one other point I wanted to make, especially, going back to kind of this top fear for more junior people. Like it'll affect my eval in my sort of promotion. I think one thing that's important is that fear is especially acute at the beginning. When you first start, there are only a couple, let's say I'm the first team going. If I'm the Admiral Burke in this example, he was the first one to go. He's a leader, so he should. But that feels like a vulnerable position. It's very acute at the beginning. But as the program starts getting rolling, the dynamic is that you see lots of people are getting feedback. Everyone's getting feedback. So everyone's in the same boat. So it changes the dynamic from this is a weird kind of thing and I'm the only one doing it to, everyone's doing it. sort of kind of de-energizes that concern. Then the next series of pages are going through kind of, specifically kind of what happens per month in challenges that arise. So in month one, so feedback is starting, you're kind of getting more people to participate. This is broken up into kind of two buckets. In particular, the very first meeting that a team launches feedback, there are mistakes that are commonly made. And I'll cover that in a second. So it matters to like start off on the right foot. And then there are issues that occur in the subsequent meetings. The first meeting is super important, and I think there's a couple of attributes. Number one is that the biggest mistake is that the leader doesn't go first. They'll kind of go up there. We're going to start giving feedback now. You all give feedback to each other. That's not a great way to do it. As opposed to saying, we're implementing a feedback program. I am going to go first and present my plan for the year, or whatever. Give me feedback. That's much more effective than having letting other people take the first step. The other thing is, second here is kind of playing it safe. If you pick a topic that is sort of not controversial or kind of humdrum or kind of boring, we've been to, no offense to the military, we've been to some meetings that are kind of like very kind of rote, sort of people are going through, here's the 20 things we go over every week, and we're just kind of doing it. And like everyone's yawning. If you do that, if you add feedback to that kind of meeting, like people don't have anything to say. There's nothing to like comment on. So what you end up with, especially if you do it repeatedly, people will write silly things, or they start treating it like a joke because it is a joke. But if you're like wasting their time. But if you actually have a meaty topic, and that Burke example was a good one, where he picked something like, here's our plan for the year. Like there's lots of things to comment on. There's lots of holes and lots of ways to make it better. That one takes more courage to do it, but you actually start getting real, useful feedback from that. The third item here in that first meeting is making the initial kickoff meeting about the feedback app. Going back to my point about kind of experiential learning versus kind of lecturing, it's a mistake to kind of have, okay, we're going to launch feedback now, so we're going to have a meeting about feedback, as opposed to say, okay, we're going to do this, but let's use a real example to learn how to do it. So I'm going to present something and do it that way. So I think how you start in part of the documentation. So this is kind of part one of our documentation, kind of what will go wrong. Part two covers the nuances of how do you run this first meeting so it best chance of success. Also, the last thing here, it's a simple one, but it's like super important for an ongoing usage of feedback to be able to make sure at the end, we use this term BIB, brilliant in the basics. Brilliant in the basics is we add into the agenda of every meeting, like 5 minutes, leave feedback. And you actually, as simple as that is, as dumb as that is, adding that 5-minute line item into the agenda makes a huge difference, because people just, the meeting's over, they run late, whatever. People just they just forget to do it. So there's just very simple things to do that help especially get it started. Then month two. So in month one, the objective is you're ramping up the volume of feedback. You're having people, practice giving more candid information, more candid truth to each other. What we typically see is that then, especially the leaders, start wondering, but the quality of this feedback is not so great. My team has never done this before. All of a sudden they're doing it. How do we make it better? We put that kind of radical candor grid that I think Charlie or Megan spoke about yesterday. But the idea is that you want to get people to be, radically candid. Unfortunately, what shows up is really this number 4 here, that truth said badly. Especially as people start practicing giving candid feedback, the reality is they haven't really done it before. Some of it will be said really badly. So we had lots of examples of this. It's not trolling, it's not inappropriate, but it's just you're giving someone truth, but just saying it in like a very unsavvy way. And that causes a lot of consternation. The team can get upset. Like people are, oh my God, I can't believe they actually said that. But then other people are like, well, I guess somebody finally said it. And that is an awkward dynamic. And what we found is a couple things. Number one, that it's a phase. You have to kind of power through it. The worst thing to do is to stifle it down. And that is I think that's sort of the natural reaction. We're going to make more rules, more procedures. We're going to punish people. We're going to, create more training. We're going to do everything to make sure that nothing bad ever happens. As opposed to, if you actually allow it to occur, but it's publicly, and people, at least in our system, of course, you can kind of thumbs up, thumbs down. Leaders can comment on it. It's not like it's just sitting there and like you let it fester. People, the crowd itself, the team itself can come comment. Like that was, maybe there's some truth there, but that was just over the line. Like we didn't like that. And so there's ways for the community to kind of garden and kind of set the norms that are acceptable to itself. But the worst thing to do is not allow it, because I like the term that was used yesterday, transit zones. If you're in that radical candor thing, to get to that zone where you want, where people are, saying challenging things, but in a good, appropriate, way that people accept, you have to allow some room for them to say it in the obnoxious aggression way. So you're just not going to learn how to do it well unless you do that. And so we've seen this where teams try to stifle it down. It actually it prolongs the process of educating the team. The other thing, I'll just call it at the top of this page. Once again, I apologize for the written document on a PowerPoint here, hard to read. But the idea is that there's a series of almost sort of skills that the team needs to evolve over time about how to give feedback in kind of a good way. Niceness versus truth, and being kind of analytical and slow versus visceral. I love this one, the quote unquote shit sandwich. We found that's very prevalent, where people, we heard this great story that someone earlier in their career was given advice: if you have to give negative, bad news to someone, make sure you cover it with, the good news, the bread. So, and the bigger the piece of shit, the bigger the bread. So you need like a huge sandwich if it's like a really horrible thing to say. But we've seen that, and there's a bunch of research around it too, how that actually creates the opposite reaction, because people, they can sense that coming like a mile away. Like, oh, you're saying this really nice thing to me, that means you're about to say something bad. And that actually makes me think, oh, you're actually kind of lying to me right now. So why am I going to trust any of this? So that there's like skills that are developed along the way that improve the candor. All that starts showing up in month 2. And then month 3, you really start seeing patterns in the data. Probably the main thing on this page, and I think it imbues a lot of what I just talked about, was this idea of defining, normally a 1 is, you define it as bad, like the worst thing in the world is getting a 1, as opposed to defining bad as not participating. The worst thing to do is what we call hiding. So people that aren't getting feedback at all, we've seen this in the data, it's like a laser correlation. Those leaders that are hiding lead the worst performing teams. And you can see that just kind of like once you hear that, you kind of intuitively know it to be true, that leaders who don't take any chances, who are very protective of information, who don't want to, rock the boat, everyone under them mimics the same behavior. And, before you know it, that whole branch of the organization is just like dead. They're not doing anything. And it is also, when you look at the data, these kind of high performing people that I talked about before, the sort of Steve Jobs types in the organization, they get lots of 1s and lots of 4s. And it's like a sinusoid. You see, if you look at their scores over time, it's like a heartbeat. And that's, living real things are like that. You get, up and down, good and bad. So you start seeing that showing up in the data. And the other thing at the end, the mistakes in using the data, I think there's a lot of sort of baggage or heritage in most organizations around using data in what we would call the elephant or 20th century way, where in particular, any kind of performance data, HR data in general, data is hoarded and data is used to punish. Like that's basically what it is. Like the only people that has the data is, HR, senior management. No one else knows anything. And we just use the data to, basically look for people that are out of compliance and yell at you. As opposed to, if you start making it transparent and use it to empower people so they can fix themselves, it creates a very different dynamic. And I think that's, going from the elephant to the cheetah org, that's one of the key things, is how do you kind of empower people, share information so everyone can make their own decisions and start driving, driving in the same direction. I love what General Brooke Leonard, one of the Air Force generals, said, that he defined leadership as being able to make daily decisions aligned to the mission. And I think that's, as simple as it is, that's what it is. How do you empower people with the right information and trust them to make their daily decisions kind of aligned with the mission? And I think that's kind of the tools and what we're doing in month 3 is around that. So as I said, this is it's kind of a dense document, so giving you a flavor here. But as we start, part 2 of this tomorrow is so how are these lessons learned kind of baked into how we launch programs. So that was kind of feedback, which is one way. That's kind of 101. That's the other academy, but it bleeds into and is closely aligned with what to expect when you start coaching programs.
All right. For those other offices, I'm Greg, one of the, I run the Boston office here, so nice to meet you virtually. So before I get into what to expect when training next gen kind of decision makers and kind of the problems and mistakes that come up, especially as you start to practice it, I want to just give a little bit of context that I think sometimes helps. Just maybe a misnomer around when we talk about problems and what goes wrong. I think sometimes there's some assumptions it's a binary. You're either kind of good or bad. And some of the discussions we had yesterday with some of the observations are, gosh, next jumpers are very vulnerable. You guys do a lot of coaching. You're very candid feedback. There are different varieties of those types of things. And the one part I share is just you're observing. I use the analogy of kind of going to the gym and thinking about things that either you're not good at or good at almost as like muscles. And it's easier in the physical, I think, component of if I was a swimmer in college, but if I, it would be a true statement. If I kind of said, God, I suck at running a marathon, right? I watch those people and a marathon runner would say, well, Greg, are you surprised you don't even train and practice running? And there's a notion sometimes I think for us that, we look at something and we're not good at it. We're surprised where you shouldn't be surprised. You take a look at, like, if I practiced, every week in running, I'd probably maybe not be the best marathon runner, but my muscles in marathon running would be a lot stronger. And so I think about these things. And in fact, I use this example one time in a feedback academy. I talked about all these lessons that go wrong, and so very similar to what Tom talked about. And he touched on kind of the shit sandwich of kind of giving kind of praise, and then you kind of hide the criticism in there. And so I talked about how this goes wrong. And so afterwards, we ran kind of a feedback session where they basically observed me giving feedback to other next jumpers, and I totally gave a shit sandwich. And someone raised their hand and said, "You totally did that, and you just coached us on that's a problem." And what I said is that's a muscle for me that's always been weak. It just was, I can look back a year or 2 years from now, and it was a lot weaker than it is now. So I say that I'm going to get into some of the what goes wrong. But I share that with you of these are all lessons, even for myself, I still work on today. And while I may have slightly stronger muscles, many of them are still very weak for me. And if I don't work in them and practice them all the time, which helps with Tom because he can see my weak muscles in ways. So given that, so let me go into the coaching. And one of the first parts in terms of that I like in here of, coaching of training the next generation decision makers. And one frame of reference that I say sometimes when people think about coaching, I ask you to think about, are you coaching great followers or are you coaching with frame of reference, next generation decision makers versus followers. So I'll start with there because that's certainly the lens that we think about and where a lot of these mistakes get made. So again, in this kind of guide that we have, that there are like 10 kind of common mistakes and biggest challenges. So I'm not going to go to all of them, but I'm going to just highlight a few of them. So the first one, Charlie and Megan touched on a little bit yesterday of more from a foundational setup of the kind of traditional coaching done in a one-on-one setup. And that's typically kind of the manager to the subordinate. So one of the things we found is some of the problems on one-on-one. So from a student perspective, one of the challenges on this is that one-on-one often kind of behind closed doors is you feel alone. So if there's mistakes, kind of development areas, there's an element of, it's set up in a dynamic where the person is kind of right, that they're the superior, they're giving you that feedback, and you feel alone. You don't share it. You may, and depending on the person, can feel shame. And I've seen this, and we don't do this as much. We used to do this, but I've seen in other orgs you go, and some of the coaching actually is done in like 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. all with best intentions. Maybe they bring in an executive coach. You have the executive coach, you have the manager, you have maybe somebody else that comes and sits down. And I'm not saying there's not a time and place, but one of the challenges on that is the more people you bring, the dynamic in the setup makes the individual feel much more alone. It also reinforces from the student that the teacher is quote unquote right, which is a dynamic that's very challenging. The also thing about it from a coaching standpoint in a one-on-one dynamic is that we often, as coaches, we teach the way that we learn. And without getting into all kind of the research behind it, there's a variety of research. There are three primary ways. Some people, learn more visually. Some people learn more semantically. Some people learn more analytically. Tom and I learn much differently. But we often, if it worked for us, we love to convey, this is what worked for us. And that's great, by the way, in the sense of that's some of the most authentic coaching, as opposed to saying how you heard it being worked for you. However, just recognize that because they're different types of learners, one of the parts in a one-on-one setting, and we've all felt this as coaches, I've certainly felt it, where I'm like, they just don't get it. It worked for me. And so you try even harder. So now you go even harder of like trying to take your lesson, and ultimately it doesn't work. And some of that is just baked into that dynamic. So that's where we found, we'll talk more tomorrow in Getting Started. You heard more yesterday, that the 2-on-2 coaching, the 2-to-4 coaching, we really think about from the student standpoint, we talk about all the time, you're kind of the primary coach is yourself. You're your self coach. Then if we can create what we call like a study group, so the next one is kind of a peer, you're second. Even when the situation workshops you saw, we came in groups of 4, they send the notes out to the peers and the coaches. And a big part, we try to kind of facilitate their learning from each other as a primary part. The more kind of senior coaches can give the kind of that guidance and expertise, but the learning isn't dependent on the one-on-one. So that's a big one. That's a foundational one. The second one is and I really struggle with this, but I see this a lot as coaches start, and I've observed many situation workshops, is this kind of deny, change, negative emotions. And there are many ways this comes up. So someone brings a problem, and there's a part where, and especially if they're vulnerable, they may bring up they're frustrated with it, etc. And we kind of deny that emotion. And there are different ways to doing it. One, you can give them a solution right away. I'm going to shut this down, and here's a solution, or you shouldn't feel too bad about that, or I've been through that before. And you kind of forget that negative part. And so it just, this would be high on my challenge. It's kind of, I see that part. I kind of want to move. I want them to feel better. I want them to be productive. I want them to kind of get back and get kind of gas. And here's the challenge. Say I give a solution to somebody, or I cut that part off. It may work. It's a little bit like candy. It may work in the little bit of short run, give them a sugar high. But here's the problem is oftentimes one solution is not enough. I don't have all the data, and something else is going to pit. They get the next mini setback, boom, they're right back to where they were before. And they're less likely to bring it up again because I just, as a coach, denied it. So just be mindful on that. Give the space. We talk about all the time here. Give the space to allow some of that negative emotion. We found also in group settings, having that kind of being out there. Remember, it's not you don't have to solve everything in the one-time coaching session. This goes on afterwards. They can talk to their peer. They can send reflection notes afterwards. But even dialing down and giving them some space for that negative emotion to come out, and actually we found to actually provoke it even a little bit further, actually lets them come to a better place in the long run. The other one is, I think this goes to one of the things we talk about is and it came up yesterday in conversation, as coaches, helping them kind of learn to fish versus catching the fish for them. One of the parts of that's that is a common mistake, is a challenge, is that the main focus ends up only being about getting them to awareness. We talk about kind of awareness and action, and one of the questions that we talk about is what comes first, motivation or action, right? So I really want to, going back to, I was a swimmer, it's a winter, it's freezing, what comes first? Like just going to the gym or going to the pool and I don't feel like it, and then get motivated, or I need to get motivated sitting on my couch, then to go to the pool and swim. And a lot of it's it's fully the narrative. And I think a great coach does need to attack the narrative. Without question, oftentimes you have bad narratives, and a great coach will help you think about the problem, your own narratives, some of the false assumptions you're making. However, we basically underplay that sometimes just getting started, just going to the pool. I mean, how many times in your own whatever thing you like to do, actually going to the pool, even if I don't feel like it at all, it's a habit, it's a ritual. I go, I come out of it, I'm like, oh, I'm so glad I went. There's something about the rituals, the patterns, and oftentimes we'll use things like, here are 3 things to get started with, or the next 3 weeks. We talk about all the time, brilliant in the basics. How do you start a meeting? How do you end the meeting? How do you start a week? And I forget oftentimes as coaches that I'll focus so much on the narratives and the mindset that I forget sometimes the most effective way in some ways to get better performance might be, in fact, to actually take a step back and saying, what are the habits, the rituals? What are simple things they can do from a what to do to get started next versus just the mindset? And so the last one I'll kind of end with, and if we have time, we'll do some questions. I know you're observing kind of an oboe, but I want to spend a little bit of time on this as students. And one of the parts we talk about is everybody in here, again, these are training next generation decision makers. We're all decision makers. Whether we're a coach, we think at Next Jump, I mean, I'm a coach, I'm a student. And so I put this, even though I have this under students, I think it goes for all of us no matter what role we are. And this one is sharing conclusions, answers, solutions only. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time. I'm putting on my glasses. I'm going to read something. But actually, someone last night, John Hillard, I don't think he's here, but he's a leader in our Boston team. Heads up, he's our CTO here, and was kind of sending out this article on it was a research brief on strengths and limitations of teams. And I love this example. It's Coast Guard, so I don't think anyone here is Coast Guard, but I think so. Let me just read it to you. So. This was it's a short paragraph, but a team can fail to notify its members, assuming they have all the information they need. So now this is a story given in a very hierarchical, kind of traditional sense, but in this lens of looking at everybody as a decision maker and a next generation leader, I'd ask you to think about this story for all of us, not just kind of, in this case, the captain. So the story is in a nighttime incident involving the U.S. Coast Guard training ship Cuyahoga, probably get that wrong. The captain noted a ship on radar, and in looking across the water, believed that he saw 2 lights, indicating the ship was proceeding in the same direction as his own ship. The first mate saw correctly that it was 3 lights, which meant that the ship was approaching them. The first mate watched as the captain made some unusual maneuvers, but the first mate assumed the captain knew the status of the ship and never considered confirming the ship was approaching. The result was a collision in which 11 Coast Guardsmen died. So I think the research brief, and it's more getting at kind of a mistake that from a leader standpoint, not sharing all the information. But I think it gets at for all of us and what goes, and it touches on what Tom was sharing on the feedback side. I think it touches on the coaching part. We use this example of kind of ladders of influence or ladders of inference. And if you think about the top level is kind of the conclusions. Here's kind of what we're going to do, the action, the solution, whatever you want to call it. Underneath there are certain assumptions. And then underneath that, they're data points. So in this case, the data point was actually a ship was approaching, right? Or there was a ship in the water. Now, there were certain assumptions, and both in that case, both saw it. In that case, for lack of a better one, the kind of the captain and the first mate saw those data points. They made different assumptions about that data point. One made an assumption it was coming at them. The other one made the assumption that it was going with them. But the only part that was discussed actually in that case was the leader who shared basically the conclusion of the action. We're going to keep going or we're going to make certain maneuvers. And think about this. I'm going to spend a little bit of time. This happens all the time. And you think about from as you coach to a student, one of the things a student will be is they'll just state the problem and here's kind of what I did. And we'll respond in a very tactical lens around kind of that part up here. And so one of the things we talk about all the time is training as decision makers to talk about the data points, the assumptions that you're making, and then getting to the conclusion. And we call it informating. And that's a role for the student. In this case here, if the captain had been able to share on both sides, if the captain had been able to share, listen, we're going to make this maneuver because, and the assumption I'm making is that ship's there, I know we're close to the ship, et cetera. Here's the part now that feedback plays. The feedback part was, in that case there, the XO or the first mate. Is the first mate XO? No, I don't know. So first mate, the other guy. He could have said, something doesn't feel right. He noticed that something didn't feel right about the maneuvers that they were making compared to the data point that he saw. That's, if you think of decision-making and feedback, that's feedback of being able to bring up and be able to speak, even though it's uncomfortable, bring it up, assuming that the captain knows what the captain's doing. That happens all the time, and we call it NQRs, little things that don't kind of not quite right, so that add up. And so there's an element in that case that the first mate could have said, raise his hand and say, I saw a data point that the ship's coming at us. I'm making that assumption. Something's not quite right about what we're doing. And so part of what we're getting at in terms of both students and coaching is to think about and to practice the skills, to practice the muscles of being able to bring up things around the underlying data points, assumptions we're making about that, as well as then having a more real discussion, and you can make richer discussions of the decisions that we're making. That has obviously very huge consequences. The challenge for all of us is that in most of the situations that we're working in our daily life, that they don't have consequences that are that. However, the fundamental principles are the same of the mistakes that we make of not sharing in many ways here. We only share the top level. We don't share the underlying data points and assumptions.